broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and welcome to the ALCTS webinar, Writing and Publishing Research Results. This is part 3 of the 5-part series, Research and Publication Basics. I'm Lisa Lorenzo, a member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee. I will be your host for today's webinar. Our presenters today are Mary Beth Weber and Sandy Rowe. Mary Beth is the head of Central Technical Services at Rutgers University Libraries. She has published extensively on technical service topics. She has edited library resources and technical services since 2012, and she also edited the ALCTS newsletter online from 2005 to 2011. Mary Beth is a longtime ALCTS member and chaired a number of interest groups and committees. She earned a BA in English and Art History at Michigan State University and an MLS from Clarion University in Pennsylvania. Sandy is a professor and senior cataloging librarian at Milner Library at Illinois State University and editor of the peer-reviewed journal Cataloging and Classification Quarterly. She is currently the vice chair and chair-elect of the Cataloging and Metadata Management section and has held offices in the ALA, LIDA, and ALCTS Authority Control Interest Group, the Alpha chapter of Beta Phi Mu, and was a member of IFLA's Subject Analysis and Access Section Standing Committee from 2009 to 2017. And Standing Committee Secretary from 2012 to 2017. They bring much expertise to today's topic, and we are very fortunate to have them with us today. A few logistics for today's presentation. All attendees are muted to prevent background noise, and we do not have interactive chat capabilities. You may, however, comment on today's presentation using Twitter. The hashtag is ALCTSCE. We do not monitor the Twitter feed, so if you have questions for our presenters, please type them into the questions box on your screen. We will have time for Q&A after the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive an email with links to the recording and presentation slides shortly after the presentation concludes. And now, here are Mary Beth and Sandy. There will be a slight delay as we change presenters.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Sandy mentioned, I'm Mary Beth Weber. Oops. I don't know what's going on here. Oh, here we go. Sorry about that. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I hope that you find this workshop useful and informative, and we're very glad that we were invited to present for it. As Sandy mentioned, as our host mentioned, I'm the editor of Library Resources and Technical Services. I'm also the head of Central Technical Services at Rutgers University. I provided a photo of myself and of the cover of the most recent issue of ALCTS. We're going to divide the presentation into 2 parts. I'm going to cover part 1, and in that part, I'm going to talk about the elements of a research paper, research methodologies, data analysis, preparing your paper, and then submission of your paper. Before I address those things, I want to talk a little bit about why people publish. There's a number of reasons for it. They want to share information that will benefit others. Sometimes they've found a solution to issues that are facing the profession. They want to share it. It could be a requirement of your position. Sometimes you're invited to submit a research paper. Often when I attend conferences or I see abstracts of people's papers, I'm going to reach out to them and say, hey, that sounds like a great idea. I invite you to submit a paper to ALCTS. And then there are some people who enjoy writing. That's what this woman is supposed to be, someone who enjoys writing. I also want to spend a little time talking about some challenges. There can be challenges when you write for publication, but don't get discouraged. Some of those challenges can include lack of experience or time or both. If that's the case, consider collaborating with someone else. Having a collaborator can help to keep you on track, and working with an experienced author can be a very beneficial experience. Regarding the time, it can take a while to research and write a paper. It can take 6 months to a year, depending on what type of survey you're doing or what type of research you're doing and pulling everything together. Another challenge could be that you don't get support from one's employer. That could be you don't get release time, or you don't work at a place where it's required for your job. I've been in that situation, and there are different things that you can do to account for that, to find time to put aside for publishing and writing. You may also be unsure that your topic is substantive enough to warrant a research paper. My advice in that case is to run your idea past a colleague or a journal editor. I'm often asked by people about ideas and whether I think that they're worth pursuing and would make a good research paper. And then the last bullet can be, a challenge can be difficulty getting started or sustaining the effort. This is definitely a challenge. Sometimes you can get started, you lose your momentum. You might consider designating a day, a week, or a specific time each day if you can manage to do either to do your work. And this is also when a collaborator is helpful to help you stay focused and on track. I know when I'm working with someone else, that makes me more accountable, that keeps me on track. Okay. I want to spend some time talking about the elements of a research paper and explain their function. Of course, there's the title. My advice is select a title that's specific and indicates the problem that your research addresses. Use meaningful words that will allow others to discover your paper in literature reviews. It's also fine, too, if you decide during the course of your research and writing, as your work progresses, that you want to change your title. I've had authors write to me and say, listen, I've decided that this title is more appropriate. Abstracts, too. There's a brief overview of your paper that gives readers a sense of the paper's content. It's essentially a summary. And journals often have a word limit for abstracts, so keep this in mind. I've seen them range anywhere from a couple sentences to a few paragraphs. There's also the introduction. This is where you introduce your topic and background information. And my advice is to use a powerful hook to capture the reader's attention. Your introduction will include a problem statement, which is typically a brief description of the issues that you're going to address. Explain to your readers why they should care about your findings. Will they benefit others? Will they provide a solution to a well-known problem? There's also the literature review. This is a very important part of your paper. It provides context for your research through a review of relevant professional literature. This is where you address past important research that relates specifically to your research problem. Then there's your research method. And this is a place in your paper where you fully explain your methods or the procedures that you use to conduct your research. If you use something like a survey or some other type of instrument, you should include that in an appendix. And also provide enough details so that people can replicate your research. And that's one of the reasons why you're publishing and presenting. Then there's your research results. This is how you demonstrate the validity of your results, and there should be no question in the reader's mind. If you cite statistics, for example, you might want to consider consulting with a statistician to confirm that the statistics, are handled correctly. And also research results include things like illustrations, tables, and figures, and they will enhance or illustrate the points that are made in your paper. Then there's the discussion part of your paper. It may also be referred to as analysis. This is where you discuss or analyze your research findings. You interpret your research findings for your readers. Never assume that people know what you mean. It's important to provide detail and context for your readers to understand. Don't make conclusions that aren't supported by your research, and focus on results that are related to your specific research problem. In conclusion, this is where you reiterate your problem statement or hypothesis and your research results. This is where you restate and summarize. Don't let your paper come to a crashing halt. And this is also not where you raise points that haven't been covered elsewhere in your paper. Occasionally I see people raise points that they haven't addressed anywhere else, and that's not the place to do it. And then the last part of your paper, which is also very important, are your references. This is where you include citations for your endnotes and also notes that you want to convey to your readers. The references are where you cite the works you've consulted, including those noted in your literature review. One thing I want to emphasize is it's very important that your citations are complete and accurate and conform to the style manual used by the journal to which you submitted your paper. If they don't conform to it, that can slow down the review. And also if you have to revise or resubmit your paper, it will be up to you to revise those things, and that's also time consuming. You don't want to slow down the process. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about getting started, some preliminary steps. One of them is to research your topic. Grab an idea while it's still fresh in your mind and you have the chance to revise your problem statement or conclusions if needed during the course of your work. Choose something that's of interest to you, and also it's important to choose something that's related to your work because you want to write about something that you know about, that you're knowledgeable about. Also, I mentioned this before, reach out to a journal editor to discuss your idea. Consider asking someone's opinion about your paper and research. Is your idea feasible? Is it appropriate for the specific journal to which you want to submit it? It's a good idea to get feedback and an informed opinion before you invest time and effort on something. Research journals is my third bullet. Research journals that might be a good match for your area of interest. Consider, have they published papers on similar topics? Are they top journals in your field or area of expertise? And then start conducting your research. If you're doing a survey, doing something like direct observation or holding interviews, the time to get started is now. Okay, I want to spend some time talking about research methodologies. Hybrid approach, depending on your topic. It's possible that you might use a combination of both types of methodologies. There's qualitative and quantitative. Qualitative methods are used to answer how or what types of questions, such as how was RDA training provided to, or what aspects of RDA did the training cover. This is where the researcher structures and interprets collected data. Qualitative research methodologies include things like direct observation, participant observation, focus groups, interviews, surveys, and document analysis. The data in qualitative research is less structured and open-ended questions are used. It's intended to understand the perspective of those being studied or surveyed and to examine their experience to gain data for your research. Qualitative research was used in Mara Thacker's paper, which was published in ALCTS. The paper is Challenges, Opportunities, and Best Practices in Overseas Buy-in Trips, an interview study focusing on South Asian specialists. In her paper, Thacker used semi-structured interviews with South Asian subject specialists that allowed for open-ended responses. Her questions included things like, how do you plan a buy-in trip? Describe the process. What factors influence which places that you visit? In comparison, quantitative research is used to determine how many and how often. For example, how many job descriptions were posted in X years for preservation librarians, or how often are tabletop games used at X library. It seeks to confirm a hypothesis and includes things like numerical analysis that's collected through polls, questionnaires, or surveys. Surveys are often used for this type of research because they're easy to prepare, they don't cost a lot of money, you get quick research collection of information. Quantitative research uses very structured questionnaires or questions that use close-ended questions, to get quantifiable answers. And with this type of research, the goal is to control for bias to understand facts objectively. And I want to provide an example of quantitative research that was reflected in a paper by Amy Buehler and Tara Cataldo, which was also published in ALCTS. The paper is Identifying E-Resources in Exploratory Study of University Students. They attempted to determine whether university students have difficulty identifying different digital information resources and whether factors such as age, level of university experience, amount of BI instruction, or amount of time searching play a role in the student's ability to correctly identify information resources. They used a survey with closed-ended questions. Students chose from a list of responses, and there were no questions that enabled the students to enter free text. So the next thing I want to talk about are analyzing your research findings once you're done. What did you learn? Were there any surprises? This is the most critical part of your research. This is where you summarize and interpret your data. What do your results mean? Why did you get these results? Have all the why questions been answered, or is further investigation needed? Don't just provide numbers, attach meaning to them, give context to your readers. Also, if there are any limitations encountered during the course of your research, you'll need to address the impact of them. They can also provide suggestions for additional research. Limitations can include things like a lack of similar research on your topic, or if your topic's very new and there hasn't been any research on it. If that's the case, consider related topics. If it seems like there's little or no literature on your topic, maybe think more broadly about it. Think about what might be related. And in an example, in the paper I just mentioned, Buehler and Cataldo's paper, they did note in their analysis that there were no prior studies that directly investigate the phenomenon of container recognition amongst college students. So for this reason, they considered this study to be a pilot that would define limitations, raise more questions, and serve as a foundation for further research that use more rigorous methodologies. And they state that their limitations included not using live search environment, and there were too many disparate individual resources to do an effective cross-comparison. A little bit more about analyzing your research findings, presenting your data. Graphs and tables are a common way to do this. Data visualization can also be used. Some authors use things like word clouds to determine dominant words and terms in their qualitative findings. It's important too when you present your data that you don't make claims that you can't support. And as I mentioned before, don't just provide numbers or facts, state why they're significant and whether or not they support your research. As far as your data analysis, for quantitative analysis, it involves things like averages, mean, median, mode, percentages. Graphs are often used to provide an overview of data and can identify outliers or exceptions. In a paper by Rodriguez-Bravo and Rodriguez-Sedano, coincidentally, they have similar hyphenated names, the paper Trends in Library Collection Circulation in Spanish Universities, they measure circulation data by user type, student, faculty, min, staff, also data from the first semester of various academic years by user types, by counting the number of checkouts, data by material type, percentages for that, downloads of e-resources, and user rates by percentage. And they reflected that in tables and graphs. Qualitative data is more difficult to measure with numbers and examines things like recurring patterns and themes. Mary Miller and Martha Horan's paper, Evolving Roles of Preservation Professionals, use qualitative research to analyze position announcements for professional preservation positions. They analyze things like demographic data, position responsibilities, and qualifications. My last bullet on this page is to include recommendations. These could be recommendations for implementing a course of action or that further research is needed. Miller and Horan, for example, note that there are areas for further study that's necessary to draw definite conclusions. And in their paper, they suggest a follow-up study using surveys or interviews with newly hired preservation professionals, and a complementary study that interviews employees to characterize perceived future needs for staffing for preservation. These are just two examples of data preservation I've referred to. Data preservation one, of course, is a graph. This is from Mary Miller and Horan's paper. And the other is a word cloud that is used in a paper that is in a forthcoming issue of ALCTS. The paper is by Roman Pashanshin, Frank Lambert, and Sabine McCutcheon, and it's on RDA training for public librarians. And what they did was they did a survey and they looked at the words that were the most predominant in their responses and presented them in a word cloud. Okay, I also want to talk a little bit about some data analysis tools. That's used by a lot of my colleagues is statistics and data modeling. Tableau, which is free, and it's used to create data visualizations, maps, things such as dashboards. SAS, what else is there? Excel, which is very easy to use. You can use it to filter data. It has graphing tools. You can create pivot tables. And some of my colleagues use Splunk. I'm not familiar with it, but I did include it here. And in your research, you do want to say what analysis tools you've used. Remember that you want others to be able to replicate and apply your results. So the more information you can provide to them, the better. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about structuring your research paper. And these are the parts of it, the outline. An outline will help you decide how you organize your information, how topics might be further subdivided. And it's a visual check for some people. Some people need to see how their paper will take shape and using an outline helps them. The title I mentioned before, to choose something descriptive and appropriate. Also consider something that will catch a reader's attention and make your paper stand out from others. Abstract, again, that's a brief abstract of your paper. Some journals also require keywords, so be prepared to provide both an abstract and possibly keywords. Format, this is very important. Follow the author instructions regarding how to format your paper, including the citation style and supplemental materials. A full-length paper can be between 5,000 and 10,000 words. The length is set by the journal. But I do want to go back to that issue of the format. It is very, very important that you follow the style manual and format for the journal. There are so many times I see people use the wrong style of endnotes, wrong style of citations. Their paper's structured differently, incorrectly, and that makes it very hard to revise their paper, review and revise it when it goes out for peer review, because sometimes those things can be a distraction, and they also end up causing the authors to spend more time revising their paper than is necessary. Okay, after format, check your references. Again, follow the journal style guide. Consult published issues of the journal to which you submitted your paper for examples if anything's unclear. If your paper is rejected by a journal and you have to submit it to another, revise your paper as necessary to conform to the style manual and submission guidelines. And as supplemental materials, they're often submitted as separate files. And again, I stress that you follow the journal's author instructions and do things like make sure you use the correct resolution for images. So after all that, the next step is to get started. So start writing. The important part is to get started and know that this will be a long process that involves many revisions. And keep in mind that nothing good is easily accomplished. Revise your paper after you've had a chance to put it aside and look at it with fresh eyes, and also prepare yourself for the fact that you're going to do numerous revisions to your paper while writing it. Get feedback. Have a colleague read it and make sure that you have a strong argument and research to support your data analysis and claims. Revise, it's going to happen again. If the person or people who provide the feedback to you are thorough and honest, you're not going to get away without further revision or refinement to your paper. And then the fun begins. Submit your paper to a journal. So the next question is where to submit. Your preliminary work should include identifying journals that are a good match for your topic and your discipline. It's a good idea to do this before you start writing rather than after. Some other considerations are what major research journals have published papers on your topic or similar topics, what journals were consulted for your literature review. Maybe they're an appropriate place to submit. What's the journal's impact factor? You do want people to discover and cite your paper. Also the acceptance rate, that's important too. Are papers peer reviewed? Where does the journal index papers? You want to consider a journal that indexes in the major databases for your discipline, and you want your paper, again, as I said before, to be discoverable. A little bit more about where to submit. Consider availability. Is the journal available broadly? Is it published electronically? How many years are covered by this format? Again, keep discoverability in mind. If the journal isn't widely available or easy to obtain, that can be just an obstacle to others finding your paper and citing it in their own research. Also copyright. Who holds the copyright to the paper? If this information isn't provided on the journal's website, ask who retains the copyright. It can be the author or it can be assigned to the publisher. That's something you want to ask about. And also ask if the journal permits authors to post published papers to an IR. The alerts author's instructions do tell you that you can and how. If you are an ALA member, and your institution or library doesn't have an IR, ALA does have one, ALA IR, and members can deposit papers there. So something you might want to consider as well. Okay, these are just references to the two papers when I showed illustrations of data analysis. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to turn things over to Sandy. Thank you for your time and attention.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm here for part 2, so congratulations on completing your research and preparing your manuscript. I'll be covering the submission to the post-publication part of the process. So this is me. As Alana said, I'm at Illinois State University, and I'm Editor-in-Chief of Cataloging and Classification Quarterly. This quote is from Illinois State University's promotion and tenure policy, and I just include it here to emphasize the importance of getting your research out beyond your university. Share your work by making it part of our professional literature. From time to time, I see folks who've done amazing research and just sort of lose steam about getting a paper about that research to press. So I just encourage you guys to consider this a part of the research process, getting your material out there. I'm very happy to hear that she always talked about before you submit, revise, get advice, revise again, expect to do a lot of revision. As an editor, I would always hope that we would never see a paper submitted that hasn't had other eyes on it than the authors. You're just too close to your own work. So don't be shy. Find those trusted colleagues to read your work and to give you honest feedback. Okay, so before the submission, again, read the instructions for authors. And these are the kinds of things in those instructions you're going to be looking for. You know, who retains the rights, the citation style, of course. And again, you'd want to know that before you prepared your manuscript so that you could do it that way the first time. I see a lot of figures and tables in color, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes there's additional charges for color, and perhaps the table or figure could still convey the information if it was in grayscale. So that's something to think about and then ask if you have questions ahead of time. Make sure you blind your manuscript if that's required, and that just means your name isn't there, the name of any co-authors aren't there. If you got a named grant, that named grant is redacted for the length of time that it's in review. If you self-cite and make it obvious somehow in your text that you're self-citing another paper of yours, those need to be blinded as well. Often folks just put, suppressed in brackets or do something that'll then make it easy for you to go through and correct that information later, that you can search and replace, whatever. If you have questions about expected turnaround time, those are completely fair questions for any editor. Especially the review process is usually pretty predictable. Reviewers are often expected to submit their review within a certain number of weeks, and so you can extrapolate when you'd hear the first decision. Expected time to publication is a lot more difficult. There's just so many factors, and often those factors are dependent on the author themselves. So feel free to ask the question, but expect a lot of if this, then this, if this, then this kinds of answers. And don't be shy about asking the editor whatever you feel is not covered, whatever your questions are not covered, or anything that's still unclear. This gives us a chance to have a conversation with the author, which we always value, or a potential author. And it'll also help us see our instructions for authors with fresh eyes. Maybe something that used to be completely clear just isn't clear anymore, or maybe something that's come up now that didn't come up before really needs to be added. So we appreciate those. Often journals these days have submission systems, and so those will sometimes have their own sets of instructions. So just read your screens. If your paper has multiple authors, you'll need to agree that one of you will become the corresponding author, and the other authors then won't get any correspondence from the system or the editor, most likely. So you'll need to agree who that is, and then hopefully that's a person that shares the decision on the paper, the reviews, the page proofs when that time comes with their other authors as needed. Include your ORCID ID in the submission system if that system permits it, both for you and for any co-authors. Once you submit your manuscript, the editor typically will read your submission and will run it through, and they may run it through a similarity check like the one that's available through Crossref, just to make absolutely certain that the paper is not has not already been published, or significant portions of the text aren't already out there in another form. If the paper is in scope, then they'll choose and assign reviewers. I know this is a pretty dense screen, but I only put it here. All these definitions are from Willer's book, Editorial Peer Review. I just want you to have a sense that there is variation among peer-reviewed journal processes. Sometimes they have different number of reviewers. Sometimes the role of the editor can be slightly different. Okay, reviewers, sometimes called referees. Typically, they're easy to figure out because they're part of a published editorial board. They're experts in the field of the journal. They're also well versed in the professional literature, going, back as far as is relevant. They have solid research skills themselves, strong interest, time to pursue it, and then as a group, as an editor, I try to make sure that my group of peer reviewers, my editorial board members, who are my peer reviewers, are from diverse geographic regions, and that some are educators, some are practitioners, and that they have diverse areas of expertise. Like other journals, you don't always just have papers on a single topic. You have papers on a variety of topics, and you need to have folks that are knowledgeable about different topics. Reviewers are once invited to review a manuscript. They either agree or they decline. Typically, they're only asked to do a given quantity per year, so you don't just absolutely bury somebody. And then they have a known deadline, so they know when they accept an invitation to review that they have to have that review filed within so many weeks from the date of assignment. They agree to maintain anonymity, so that means if an editor will not assign a reviewer to a paper who is at the same institution as a co-author or author, the reviewer, if they recognize the project, the research, the writing, or suspect that they know the author, they're responsible to decline to review. But still, sometimes you may not realize the connections between folks. So again, you always want the reviewer to decline to review if there's any, if they have any idea that they might actually know who the author is. And then, of course, they'll write reviews that are based on the journal's guidelines. These definitions are probably not a surprise to you guys, but the thing that I value so much as an editor is you really need that expert assessment of the manuscript for publication. There's common criteria for reviewers across disciplines: scope, content, organization, bibliography, and finally, is it a useful contribution to the literature? In content, you might think about the structure of the article that was gone over in part 1, the soundness of the research methodology for whatever you're trying to prove or disprove or discover. that the tables and figures and illustrations really support the content rather than distract from them, that they make more clear instead of less clear. The timeliness and coverage of the citations. So don't, like was also already said, sometimes you might need to go a little bit broader than your topic when you do your literature review. Try to resist citing only those things that you happen to have online full text to. Sometimes that seminal article might be, you might have to go after it a different way. So those, if a reviewer submits a well-done review, it addresses these criteria that we just talked about. It provides comments on both strengths and weaknesses. And then only lastly, addresses any copy edited problems, typos, punctuation, grammar. But this isn't by any means the bread and butter of a review. Ideally, those things have been caught by the author before submission. And it's another reason to have somebody else's eyes on your manuscript before you submit it. If there's been carelessness, especially with typos, it really does reflect on an author's work overall. And so it's just something that you don't want to have happen. You don't want folks doubting your the quality of your research because of the typos in your text. Okay, the decision. So an editor will receive reviews back from however many reviewers have been assigned. There's rejection decisions and accept decisions. Flat out reject, of course, they don't consider the paper correctable. Often the kinds of things in this bucket might be some sort of fatal flaw in the methodology itself. Reject and resubmit decisions are what that means is that there's still a lot of interest in the paper, but a significant amount of work needs to be done to make it acceptable for re-review. And so then if the author should choose to do the resubmit part, it'll again go out for review. Accept decisions are as is. These are rare, very rare. I think I've only had, 3 or 4 over the last 10 years. You can do pending minor revision or pending major revision. With major revision, a resubmission will often go back out to reviewers, and sometimes even with a minor revision decision. Again, it's the discretion of the editor. It's the editor's role to read both reviewers' reviews and their recommendations, and to come up with one recommendation to give to the author. They get the reviewer's text as well, of course. Often this is not a problem. Both reviewers are agreed on what should happen. Sometimes the reviewers are diametrically opposed on their recommendation for a paper. It doesn't happen very often, but again, I have seen where one reviewer says accept as is, never seen anything better, and another reviewer will do reject and resubmit. So sometimes in those situations, an editor may go out to a third reviewer, and sometimes they may choose to select a decision that could be any of those, accept as is or reject and resubmit, and try and explain to the author why they made that decision. Oh, wrong direction. Okay, so you've submitted your paper and it's been reviewed and you've gotten back a request for revisions. This is the most common decision we give. It's not intended to be bad news. It's intended to be helpful. So please don't let a reject and resubmit decision stop you from revising your work. Please do address each of the concerns expressed by the reviewers, but at the same time, remember that there's more than one way to do that. If you feel like a reviewer has asked you to do something that you thought was already clear in your paper, or that the reviewer is asking you to do something that you think is out of scope, or that you think is covered in some other way, or just make your case to the editor. What an editor doesn't want to see is the author respond to the reviewer concerns by saying, no, 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 no. So please, if you don't believe that a reviewer concern is warranted, make your case. Note too that decisions that require revision may come with timelines. So this is just an example. You might have 30 days to submit a revision for a accept with minor revision decision. You'll likely have longer if it's a major revision decision and so forth. And if those aren't spelled out to you at the time you get the decision, feel free to follow up and ask. Okay, final mile markers. I can't imagine that this is a tough one, but do hang on to the file that's the final version that you submit or that you upload to the submission system for the journal. So you've submitted your original manuscript, maybe you've been through a revision, maybe you've even been through a second revision. So that very last revision that you submit to through the submission system, and that's the one that gets accepted as is, hang on to that text, because that's the one that you may need to upload to your RIR or all the other places that could go. After you receive your acceptance decision, you'll at some point see page proofs. Usually these are through a separate galley correction system that you won't have seen, but you'll get instructions, you'll get a link how to get to your page proofs. Excuse me. This isn't a time for any kind of rewrite on your part, but do make sure that no errors have been introduced to your paper through the typesetting process, that the tables and the figures are displaying as you anticipated. Excuse me, that they're clear. Every now and then we'll see resolution. Make sure that if there's small type in a table or publication that it's legible. Again, if you have questions about color or grayscale, make sure that you've got these answered by this point. If you do find a word missing that was missing in the one you submitted, don't feel like you can't ask that it be added. So small corrections are fair game. What you should see next is an early release of the version of record, and it should have been assigned a DOI at this point. So this means your article has been accepted, that it's been published. It's just not yet available as part of a journal issue. And different providers call these different things. Elsevier uses Articles in Press. Taylor and Francis uses Latest Articles. Excuse me. So this is a way to get for the publisher to get your article out for folks to view in advance of the publication of the issue. So it's a good thing. The only difference between this early release and what will ultimately be folded into the journal is that it often doesn't have its pagination. Otherwise, it should be identical. If you ever need to cite an article that's still in early release, don't forget to use the DOI. That will remain persistent even after the article is folded into its issue. Okay, after publication, boy, sorry. This is when we go back to the very beginning. You really need to get your research out there. You need to share it with the professional community. You need to make sure that you've done all you can to make folks be aware of what you found, what you discovered, what new information you've added to the professional literature. So, of course, share it within your organization. You often will have been pushed to research by that organization anyway, so hopefully they'll want to help celebrate your success and get the word out to the professional community outside your organization. So social media, if you want to share it on a list, some other way, tweet. And then typically you'll be given, well, I don't know, probably our publishers differ about this, but one model is that you're given perhaps a specific link, and the first 50 people that go to that link get a complimentary download. It's a version of what was formerly called reprints. If you're as old as I am, when you got 25 or 50 physical copies of your paper article that you could mail out to folks that ask you for it. So this is the current flavor of that. If it's permitted, and it's widely permitted these days, but again, you should find this out before you ever choose which journal to submit to. Deposit the appropriate version with the appropriate attribution, if required, into your institution's IR, ALA's IR, or some other website. So there's no reason at this point not to do that, and I would encourage you to do that. The appropriate version is often the last version that you submitted, and that's why a few slides ago I asked you to make sure that you had that, you knew which one that was, and it was going to be easy for you to pull out of your folder. The version of record typically remains the one that is on the publisher's website. So that's usually not the version that you would want to put into your IR or some other website. So anyway, just make sure that you understand the language that the journal provides in their author rights information, and that you know what to do when it's time to do it, and that you actually follow through and make it widely available. There's no reason not to if it's permitted. I have a lot of, especially international authors, who increasingly cite articles that they've found through institutional repositories as opposed to publishers' websites. So it's a way to make your article available to folks that don't have access to a subscription to those journals. Okay, lastly, track your article's views and citations. We've been able to do this for some time. Less newer are the social media metrics like the altmetric donut, and these can be available from the publisher. My institution uses bpress, and we've got them in our IR or some other website. And those kinds of, that information about your article will say something to your institution about the value of your article to its community. So it's one way that you can say to those folks that are evaluating you for tenure or promotion or whatever it might be, that your article had an impact in the profession and the professional literature and the conversation of your profession. So anyway, it's no reason not to toot your own horn at this point, especially if that's why, if that's one of the reasons that pushed you to do research and writing to begin with. My last screen is just simply notes for the things that I've had in my, that I've mentioned. The site for our ISU salary and promotion. I put Taylor and Francis author rights policies here, just for your information. The book about peer review. Oh, I didn't mention this, but I meant to. Many years ago, library information science editors met and created a website. They wanted to do several different things, and that website is still available. And one of the things that you'll find there under resources for reviewers are reviewer criteria for, I don't know, half a dozen journals. So if you want to take a closer look at what a reviewer is expected to react to about your manuscript, that's a place for you where you can go and look at reviewer guidelines. They're really not widely available in any other way, but you'll find them on this site. Other things that are here are, there were best practices for LIS editors that this group developed. There were ethics for LIS editors that were developed. And so anyway, this is still an interesting site. Okay, I think we're ready for questions.
All right. Thank you, Sandy, and thank you, Mary Beth. This has been really informative and very helpful. So to our attendees, if you haven't already done so, please go ahead and type any questions you have into the questions box. And we do have one that came in already, which is how many reviewers are typically assigned to a paper?
I can go first if you want, Sandy, since you were talking and you probably want to rest for a few minutes. With alerts, it's 2, and then if a paper has to be revised and resubmitted, there will be 2, and in the second round, it's typically one of the people from the first time and then a new person.
Yeah, we're very similar. I assign 2 reviewers to each manuscript. Every now and then, if I want to give a new person some reviewing experience, sometimes I'll add that person as a 3rd reviewer, just to give that person some practice. The other thing that I do is I share the reviews of each reviewer with the other reviewer. Sometimes that can help. It's interesting for the reviewers. They really appreciate it, and it can sometimes help kind of grow the skills of both reviewers. If I send a paper out for re-review for some reason, I try to do the same 2 reviewers if they're available. If they're not, I'll pull someone else.
Okay, thanks. I think this one is for Sandy. It says, could you share that website you mentioned with reviewers criteria? And then if you don't have it now, then if maybe we could send it out with the email later. That would also be okay.
Sure. It's actually not a very difficult URL. It's just www.lis-editors.org/resources. And then you'll see a drop down for resources for reviewers, resources for authors, and resources for editors. And in each case, there are citations, recommended readings, and other information.
Okay, perfect, thanks. And the next question we have is, what are the presenters' thoughts on open peer review?
Good question.
I do kind of follow it, curious about it. I have no direct experience with open review.
I don't either. I am not opposed to it, but like Sandy, I have no experience with it. I may have heard of it. I'm aware of it going on. Seems to happen more in certain types of disciplines.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Our next one says, for hybrid research methods, do you have any examples for that?
No, I knew somebody was going to ask this. Sometimes when people have surveys, they might look at both the numbers and also the patterns that emerge. For example, there's a paper that's in the forthcoming issue, which they did a survey. It was about RDA training for public librarians, but they looked at numbers as well as patterns, like how the teaching was offered, at what point, and things like that. It's probably not the best answer to the question, but I'd say in most cases, and in many cases, probably people's research touches on both of those a little bit.
Right. That makes sense. Okay, the next question we got is, for a publisher of books, if they see your presentation listed in a conference and ask you if you're interested in writing, what kinds of questions should you ask them?
That's a great question. I guess I would ask them, if it's a book publisher, they probably want, book publishers typically want something, an idea that's thought out from beginning to end, or maybe they want something that's a chapter, and they do have guidelines for submitting a proposal and what you're going to address and your plan of action and those types of things. I guess I would ask to see those things. I'd ask for more information.
All right, I think we have time for one more question, and we also just have one more left in here as of now. So that one is, if someone asks for a personal narrative for a book chapter, do the same parts of research apply?
I'm not sure what you mean by a personal narrative.
Yeah, maybe if the person who asked that question, if you have time, you can just clarify a little bit about what you mean there. In the meantime, actually, one more question came in, and I think we have a few minutes left still. So they asked, is it usually expected that a paper that you present at a conference has not been previously published elsewhere?
No, that's not true, because there are times when I see papers and I've learned now from experience that I have to see if that paper's actually been published, because there have been 2 cases where I thought that would make a great paper and it's already been published.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely fine to present after publication. There's no reason not to.
Okay. So going back to the personal narrative question, so the asker said they wanted to know of a personal experience written in a narrative style. So the original question had been, if someone asks for a personal narrative for a book chapter, do the same parts of research still apply?
Some of them, of course, broadly speaking, like a title, abstract, and those types of things. But if it's a personal narrative, I would think it's of your personal experience, and I don't know whether, in my opinion, I probably would not structure it the same way. But again, that goes back to what's required for the book. I know I've worked with certain publishers, they have certain criteria. They're very specific about what they want to be covered and how.
Right.
Yeah, I agree. A whole different style. I mean, you wouldn't have a methodology, results, conclusion. That's a whole different style of writing.
Okay, thank you. And that's all the questions we've actually gotten. So thank you all for being with us today. You will soon receive a short online evaluation form. Please take a few minutes to respond to the questions. Your comments are very valuable and help the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee plan future events. The email will also include links to today's slides and recording. You now have the opportunity to receive a certificate of attendance. That information will also be in the email. So thank you again to our presenters, Mary Beth Weber and Sandy Rowe. Thanks also to members of the Continuing Education Committee, Catherine Balick and Joseph Olivares, and to Alana Warren from the ALCTS office. The support they provide makes it possible for us to present these webinars. ALCTS has other continuing education events coming up. Please see the ALCTS website to register or find more information on this and other upcoming webinars. And ALCTS also offers web courses, which are 4 to 6 weeks long, as well as 2-day email discussions. Our next e-forum will be on April 16th, discussing assessing collections for diversity and inclusion. And you may check the website for information on upcoming courses and discussions as well. Thank you all for joining us today, and this concludes our session.